Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. So for this week's box office roundup video, for the weekend that ended on December 22nd, 2024, 3 new movies made it into this weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office. And the cumulative total earnings for this weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office rose quite a bit, up to $129.7 million, which was a 79.21% increase over last weekend's adjusted cumulative total of $72.4 million. So it was a much happier weekend for domestic movie theaters. But before proceeding, if you're enjoying this video, please consider pressing the like button, and if you'd like to see more of my content, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel. And I want to convey my deepest thanks and appreciation to everyone who has subscribed. This weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office included the following. Opening at number 1 was Paramount Pictures, Sega Sammy Group's Original Films, Marsa Animation Planets, and Blur Studios' animated threequel entitled Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Opening at number 2 was Walt Disney Pictures' animated prequel entitled Mufasa the Lion King. Falling to number 3 was Universal Pictures and Mark Platt Productions' musical fantasy entitled Wicked, starring Cynthia Erivo, Ariana Grande, Jeff Goldblum, and Michelle Yeoh. Falling to number 4 was Walt Disney Animation Studios' sequel entitled Moana 2. And finally, opening at number 5 was Angel Studios, Sky's Fall Entertainment's, Radiate Films, 10 Ton Productions, and 2521 Entertainment's post-apocalyptic survival drama entitled Homestead. So if you're not particularly into the Christmas mood this year, a post-apocalyptic survival drama might just be what you're looking for. And yes, that was intended to be sarcastic. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 opened by earning $62 million domestically and only $1.4 million internationally for a global gross opening weekend box office total of $63.4 million. Most of this movie's international premieres haven't yet occurred, but will on or after Christmas Day, so next weekend's international box office should be a lot higher. I'll have more to say about this movie later in the video. Mufasa the Lion King opened by earning $35 million domestically and $87.2 million internationally for a global gross opening weekend box office total of $122.2 million. I'll also have a lot more to say about this particular movie later in the video. Wick earned another $13.5 million during the weekend and $11.2 million during the week domestically, $21.5 million internationally, and $46.2 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $383.9 million, $187.4 million, and $571.3 million respectively. So as of this weekend, Wick became the 3rd highest grossing movie domestically for 2024 by surpassing the $361 million that Despicable Me 4 earned during its domestic theatrical run. Moana 2 earned another $13.1 million during the weekend and $8.6 million during the week domestically, $51.6 million internationally, and $73.3 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $359.1 million, $431.1 million, and $790.2 million respectively. Moana 2 is currently 2024's 5th highest grossing movie domestically so far this year, as well as 2024's 4th highest grossing movie worldwide. Homestead opened by earning just under $6.1 million domestically, but currently has no international box office earnings to report. I'd love to know in the comments below whether you watched any of these 5 movies this weekend and what you thought about them if you did, or whether you weren't interested in seeing any of them. But moving on, as I had alluded to earlier in the video, the 3 highest grossing movies for 2024 changed as of this weekend. Domestically, the 3 highest grossing movies for 2024 are now Disney Pixar's animated movie Inside Out 2, Disney and Marvel Studios' MCU movie Deadpool and Wolverine, and Universal's Wicked, with domestic box office earnings of $653 million, $636.7 million, and $383.9 million respectively. So Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine remain the only two movies so far this year that have broken $600 million domestically, and Deadpool and Wolverine became the highest-grossing R-rated movie of all time domestically. But globally, the three highest-grossing movies for 2024 remain Inside Out 2, Deadpool and Wolverine, and Illumination Entertainment's animated sequel Despicable Me 4, with earnings of $1,698.6 million, $1,338.1 million, and $969.2 million respectively, and with only minuscule changes in earnings occurring internationally for Inside Out 2 and Despicable Me 4. And Inside Out 2 has now earned $253 million more than last year's highest-grossing movie, Barbie, which earned $1,445.6 million, and Deadpool and Wolverine became the highest-grossing R-rated movie worldwide of all time, as well as the MCU's sixth highest-grossing movie worldwide of all time. Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine are the only two movies that have earned more than $1 billion worldwide so far this year, and Despicable Me 4 is only the third movie so far this year that has broken $900 million worldwide. The reported production budgets for Inside Out 2, Deadpool and Wolverine, and Despicable Me 4 are $200 million, $250 million, and $100 million respectively. And to estimate what their break-even point ranges might be, I'll multiply each movie's production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. And when I do that, we get the following estimated break-even point ranges. For Inside Out 2, we get an estimated break-even point range of $500 million to $600 million. For Deadpool and Wolverine, we get an estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. And for Despicable Me 4, we get an estimated break-even point range of $250 million to $300 million. Thus, all three of these movies have made bank. That brings us to several other movies that I am continuing to track but are no longer in or never were in the top 5, and they include the following. Falling to number 6 was Paramount Pictures, Scott Free Films, Lucy Fisher's and Douglas Wick's historical drama Gladiator 2, starring Paul Mescal, Denzel Washington, and Pedro Pascal. Falling to number 7 was Columbia Pictures, Sony Pictures, Marvel Entertainment's and two other studios' supervillain movie entitled Kraven the Hunter. Falling to number 8 was New Line Cinemas, Warner Brothers Animations, Sola Media's, Wingnut Films, and Domain Entertainment's animated fantasy entitled The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. And rising to number 19 was Universal Pictures and DreamWorks Animation's movie entitled The Wild Robot. But wait, how shocking! The movie entitled Y2K, which only opened 2 weeks ago and features Rachel Zegler, has already left theaters.
Weird.
What a pity. It was simply just too much of a pointless flop to continue. Gladiator 2 earned another $4.5 million domestically, $9.7 million internationally, and $17.8 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $153.9 million, $262.3 million, and $416.2 million respectively. Kraven the Hunter earned another $3.1 million during the weekend and $3.3 million during the week domestically, $10.4 million internationally, and $16.8 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $17.4 million, $25.4 million, and $42.8 million respectively. The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim earned another $1.3 million during the weekend and $1.5 million during the week domestically, $2.3 million internationally, and $5.1 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $7.4 million, $8 million, and $15.4 million respectively. The Wild Robot earned another $50,000 domestically, $990,000 internationally, and $1.1 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $143.1 million, $181.1 million, and $324.2 million respectively, and it has already made bank. Now, to know whether these movies are going to break even or not, as well as how much money they might be losing, we need to estimate their break-even points. When a movie's marketing budget is known, we can add it to the movie's production budget and then multiply the sum by 2. Otherwise, we can multiply the production budget by 2.5 for a single mid-range estimated break-even point, or by both 2.5 and 3.0 for a broader estimated break-even point range. Both methods account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves. For Sonic the Hedgehog 3, with its production budget of around $122 million, as reported by the New York Times, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $305 million to $366 million. For Mufasa the Lion King, with its production budget of $200 million, as reported by multiple sources, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $500 million to $600 million. Since Wicked and Moana 2 have identical reported production budgets of $150 million, each of them has an estimated break-even point range of $375 million to $450 million. For Gladiator 2, with its reported very high production budget of $250 million, as reported by Variety, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. For Kraven the Hunter, with its reported production budget of $110 million, according to Variety, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $275 million to $330 million. For The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, with its reported production budget of $30 million, as reported by Slash Film, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $75 million to $90 million. For The Wild Robot, with its production budget of $78 million, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $195 million to $234 million. So in this video, I am no longer projecting or never have projected what the final domestic or global gross box office earnings might be for the movies Gladiator 2 or The Wild Robot, because their expected future earnings are either currently too small, possibly non-existent, or going unreported, or their projected earnings aren't much higher than their current earnings. For Gladiator 2, with its reported global gross box office earnings of $416.2 million and its estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million, the movie currently stands to lose somewhere on the order of $208.8 million to $333.8 million in global gross box office revenue. But The Wild Robot has already made bank. Then, by dividing the losses in global gross box office revenue by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, the affected studios currently stand to lose the following. For Gladiator 2, Paramount Pictures, Scott-Free Films, Lucy Fisher, and Douglas Wick currently stand to lose around $104.4 million to $166.9 million. And that now brings us to the movies whose final domestic and global gross box office revenues I am currently projecting, which includes Sonic the Hedgehog 3, Mufasa the Lion King, Wicked, Moana 2, Kraven the Hunter, and Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. For Sonic the Hedgehog 3, using a range of possible average weekly drops from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $155 million at the low end, $177.1 million at the mid-range, and $206.3 million at the upper end. Then by using an estimated domestic share of 47.7%, which is the average of the first two movies' individual domestic shares, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $324.9 million at the low end, $371.2 million at the mid-range, and $432.6 million at the upper end. So with the movie's estimated break-even point range of $305 million to $366 million, the movie will probably break even, but in the event that it doesn't, then it may lose as much as 0 to $41.1 million in global gross box office revenue, which, when divided by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, means that Paramount Pictures, Sega Sammy Group, Original Film, Marsa Animation Planet, and Blur Studio may lose around 0 to $20.5 million. For Mufasa the Lion King, using a range of possible average weekly drops from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $87.5 million at the low end, $100 million at the mid-range, and $116.5 million at the upper end. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 28.64%, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $305.5 million at the low end, $349 million at the mid-range, and $406.7 million at the upper end. So with the movie's estimated break-even point range of $500 million to $600 million, the movie will probably flop and may lose as much as $93.3 million to $294.5 million in global gross box office revenue, which, when divided by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, means that Walt Disney Pictures may lose around $46.7 million to $147.3 million. For Wicked, using a range of possible average weekly draws from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $421 million at the low end, $429.7 million at the mid-range, and $441.1 million at the upper end, which is slightly lower than last week's projection, but after it breaks $400 million, that will further solidify its position as being the third highest grossing movie domestically for 2024. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 67.2%, which is lower than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $626.4 million at the low end, $639.4 million at the mid-range, and $656.3 million at the upper end, which is slightly higher than last week's projection. So while Wicked continues to outperform Moana 2 domestically, it won't be able to catch up to Moana 2's global gross box office earnings since Moana 2 is earning a lot more money internationally than Wicked, which is why Moana 2's domestic share is also so much lower than Wicked's by around 20%. But Wicked has already made bank. For Moana 2, using a range of possible average weekly draws from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $391.6 million at the low end, $399.2 million at the mid-range, and $409.3 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projection. So it has become increasingly likely that Moana 2 won't be able to outperform Wicked domestically. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 45.44%, which is lower than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $861.7 million at the low end, $878.5 million at the mid-range, and $900.7 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projection. So Moana 2 won't be able to break $1 billion globally, and it is becoming increasingly unlikely that it will be able to break $900 million, so while it doesn't currently have the potential to outperform any of this year's 3 current highest grossing movies worldwide, it has already made bank. For Kraven the Hunter, this is Sony's and Columbia Pictures' 18th Marvel movie, which began with their 1997 Marvel movie entitled Men in Black. Using the first 17 movies' combined average weekly drop of 34.32% with a standard deviation of 9.48%, that creates a range of possible average weekly drops for this movie from 24.84% to 43.80%. And using that range, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $25.7 million at the low end, $29.7 million at the mid-range, and $36.7 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projection. And that entire range is even further below the green dashed line towards the top of the chart, which represents the $43.8 million in final domestic box office revenue earned by Madam Web earlier this year, further increasing the likelihood that Kraven the Hunter, which has the lowest domestic opening weekend box office earnings for all of Sony's Marvel movies, is very likely going to end up having the lowest final domestic box office earnings as well. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 40.7%, which is lower than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $63.1 million at the low end, $73 million at the mid-range, and $90.2 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projection, and it's also further below the $100.3 million that was earned by Madam Web globally earlier this year, as shown by the green dashed line in the chart. Thus, it is increasingly likely that Kraven the Hunter will replace Madam Web as the lowest grossing Sony Marvel movie worldwide of all time. And with the movie's estimated break-even point range of $275 million to $330 million, Kraven the Hunter is a bona fide flop as it currently stands to lose somewhere on the order of $184.8 million to $266.9 million in global gross box office revenue, which, when divided by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, means that Columbia Pictures, Sony Pictures, Marvel Entertainment, and 2 other studios currently stand to lose around $92.4 million to $133.4 million. And finally, for The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, using a range of possible average weekly drops from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $11.6 million at the low end, $12.6 million at the mid-range, and $13.9 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projection. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 47.95%, which is higher than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $24.2 million at the low end, $26.3 million at the mid-range, and $29 million at the upper end, which is lower than last week's projection. With the movie's estimated break-even point range of $75 million to $90 million, The Lord of the Rings: The War of the Rohirrim is a bona fide flop, as it currently stands to lose somewhere on the order of $46 million to $65.8 million in global gross box office revenue, which, when divided by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, means that New Line Cinema, Warner Brothers Animation, Sola Media, Wingnut Films, and Domain Entertainment currently stand to lose around $23 million to $32.9 million. So to recap, Kraven the Hunter, Lord of the Rings: The War of the Rohirrim, and Gladiator 2 are definite flops, while Mufasa the Lion King is a likely flop. But The Wild Robot, Deadpool and Wolverine, Inside Out 2, Despicable Me 4, Moana 2, and Wicked have all made bank, while Sonic the Hedgehog 3 could potentially break even. Please let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video and whether you have or are planning to see any of the movies that I talked about. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to each and every one of you who has subscribed to support this channel. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, and Blue Sky by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.